Hi. So I just landed in Seattle and I went straight to a local park and did the Coal Creek Falls Trail. It's not bad. I mean, you don't really get too many interesting waterfalls outside of Canada, I suppose, in North America. But this one was, for the west coast of the U.S. was okay. On the way here, I picked up my copy of the Christian Science Monitor, which is a very good publication, even if you're not Christian, or I should say Christian Scientist. And there was a quote in there about the Europeans thinking about taxation. And a European was saying that ultimately, I think it was an academic, ultimately the idea behind a digital tax on multinational corporations, the rationale behind it was that you're getting this real estate that is very similar to having a building on what would be the equivalent of Beverly Hills. And you're not paying taxes on it. And what we ought to do, we ought to think of a system where governments can tax based on relative value. And this is a radical idea. And the reason the academic was able to come up with this idea was because, first of all, Europe doesn't really have that many technology companies compared to the United States. Almost all of the infrastructure, digital and analog, of your phone is either a Google or an Apple situation. The hardware might be assembled in Asia, but ultimately, other than say Siemens, probably a few French and German companies, you don't really have too many multinational technology companies worth mentioning. The ones that were quite good, like ARM, out of the UK, were bought out, I believe, by US companies. And part of the reason is, of course, is that the U.S. companies can afford to defend essentially an insecure digital infrastructure that was meant to be open when it was first created by DARPA. I believe it was called ARPANET. So what's interesting is that just the fact that the academic doesn't realize how radical his idea is, because in the past, if you did own a store in Beverly Hills and you paid taxes, you paid property taxes, and you would pay a higher tax base, whether it was sales or otherwise income, you would pay it because you were expecting services from the government, particularly police services. You were expecting essentially a responsive government. You weren't trying to bilk anyone based on your location. Although, of course, you could charge higher prices because of the cachet of your address based on your posh location. And so one of the things you want to think about when you think about ideas of cross-border taxation is this idea that ultimately what you want to do is position governments to think in terms of taxation in exchange for something. And if you're going to have a digital tax, what you really need to do is come up with essentially a police force for the digital realm. In the same way that a Beverly Hills location would pay perhaps a higher tax base or a higher tax based on its proximity to what we would presume would be an honest police department that would be responsible, or even if not an honest police department, a police department that would be responsive to your security needs. So if Europe wants, or the United States wants to talk about a digital tax, what they have to do in order for it to make sense is tie it to a service by the government. And the fact that the Europeans and the Americans are speaking about a digital tax without explaining what the businesses will get in exchange tells you that a lot of the online security has moved into the private sector. So in other words, even though the United States has a cyber command somewhere, ultimately private security companies have perhaps leapfrogged a lot of the government's ability to essentially defend the infrastructure that it helps make. So that's one of the ideas right there. The other idea, let's totally shift. The other idea in the magazine was a criticism of China's policy of each country's ability to progress on the matter of human rights based on its own timeline and its own development. And the Europeans and the Americans were criticizing China because they were basing this on this Enlightenment idea of universal human values. And the idea is that if a value or a right is universal in nature, It's not dependent on GDP. It's not dependent on the security of your supply chain. It exists essentially as a fact, whether it's a priori or something else. And let's talk about that. One of the way that it was discussed, in particular in this context, was the context of the fact that China does not allow its citizens to own the land under their property, and that was really the criticism. And it was also in the idea that condo owners or apartment owners were not able to freely elect and select their essentially homeowners associations or condo owners associations. So all this was taken out of context. Let me try to explain quickly why this was all these Western criticisms have missed the mark. So first of all, any criticism of China is you have to see whether or not it's legitimate. All you have to do is compare it to Singapore. If China is modeling its policies on Singapore, the most successful political system in the entire world in the 21st century, then you have to see whether or not the criticism is legitimate based on whether the United States is also willing to criticize its ally, Singapore. And what's really happening here with these 99-year leases, which I believe can be transferred from generation to generation, what's really happening here is that countries like China and Singapore have high populations relative to their landmass. So within China, they can't have a US-style housing system. They have 1 billion people. A small city in China would be between 5 and 10 million people. A small one. In America, a metropolitan area of 5 to 10 million people would be in the top 5 or top 10 certainly in terms of size. So one of the things that the United States has in its favor is a small population, low population density, and a lot of land. And what that allows for is the idea of having single-family homes with a backyard as opposed to the Asian model, which is more high-rises. And whether it's Hong Kong, Singapore, or China, the idea has been under this quote-unquote communist system that you wanted to provide housing for as many people as possible. It wasn't necessarily an investment. It was really a situation where you wanted to make sure there are no homeless people. And in fact, Singapore, I've never seen a homeless person. So the first thing you want to think about is if you're China and you want to have city planning that works, what model do you pursue? The obvious answer would be Singapore. Shenzhen, the free port, the free trade zone, all that was modeled in a sense on Singapore. And so you have this idea that China knows what works and is trying to replicate those processes. And overall, what has happened in China is that if you're going to build up as opposed to sideways, in order to maximize your ability to house more people, then you necessarily have to be in charge of city planning. If you don't, you have a situation like Mexico City. In Mexico City, which is one of the largest cities in the whole world, the metropolitan area would be between 5 and 20 million people. If you go to Mexico City, it's not really a contiguous city. It is a wonderful place to visit, precisely because if you go 15 minutes in any direction, you're in a totally different neighborhood. Might as well be in a different country. If you're in Polanco, that's all EU money, foreign investment. You can't even find a good Mexican food restaurant. They're all European restaurants, Spanish and so on, American, etc. Then if you go into a more traditional area, not Coyoacan, but I can't pronounce the name, it's a long one, but that's my favorite area. I'll do the best I can. Cuauhtémoc, my favorite area. It looks, completely different. Even the architecture is different. And in some places, because Mexico was colonized by the Spanish and then the French, you'll even see architecture resembling Northern Africa, like the Riyadh and so on. So what makes Mexico a lovely place to visit, and perhaps one of the top 5 places in the world to visit, also makes it a little bit more difficult to live. Because the subway system is difficult to navigate. And China, of course, has a proven record in infrastructure, both green and otherwise, trains, etc. It had to, because it doesn't have oil. Well, it has oil, but it has to import it, right? Sinopec can't produce all the oil it needs. It is not energy independent like the United States. So again, what you're hearing in terms of criticism of human rights is really based on geography and population density, which necessitates different development schemes. Now, China does not want to end up like Mexico City. It wants to be a place where it's a great place to live and hopefully to visit as well. But there's no way that it's going to be as vibrant as Mexico City. And China is okay with that because a centralized government system, what the idea behind it is not only convenience, but this idea that you're exchanging a little bit more of a homogeneous structure in exchange for less corruption, hopefully, as well as more security and more predictability. When you're trying to create jobs for 1 billion people, you are probably going to prioritize within that kind of a system, a centralized system. Now, what is interesting also is, of course, the criticism of China also ignores its history as a colonized country. Hong Kong was stolen from China. Taiwan also essentially stolen from China because when the Chinese elites lost the Chinese Revolution, they fled China and went to Taiwan, where Eisenhower's Navy protected them. So Macau, the home of the famous Portuguese egg tarts, again, stolen from China. And we don't consider these places as stolen because we don't know our history very well in the West. And let's talk about that. These places, we don't consider them to be stolen from China because ultimately what happened was there was essentially either outright war or a treaty that was signed under duress that would give the Western powers access to the port of a foreign country. And that's essentially what Hong Kong is, right? What is it? It's a port. What is Singapore? A port, colonized by the British. What is Taiwan? Again, a former Supreme Court justice used to call Taiwan essentially an aircraft carrier for the United States military. Okay, that was what Taiwan used to be, in his eyes. And so obviously, based on globalization, based on the importance of shipping, based on the importance of globalized trade, much of it which is done on, in fact, most of it, which is done on by sea. What you essentially have is a system where you are prioritizing port access in order to essentially export your currency and therefore your rules, your laws, and so on. Now, what is interesting is how that happens. And the way it happens is oftentimes by foreign direct investment that is not regulated properly. So Hong Kong, of course, was given back to China under what was called one country, two systems. And, there's a question as to whether or not China is honoring that agreement. But, it's not just Asia. It's also, say, Guantanamo Bay. Why does the United States have essentially a military outpost in Cuba? Again, prospect of war. Rather than outright war, you're better off signing a treaty that gives a nearby power access to either a port or some sort of security position that allows them to conduct surveillance or whatnot. At least in the past, you had to be a little bit closer to an area in order to surveil it, based on technological prowess in the past. And so once you understand China's history, you understand, number one, the hesitancy towards having, number one, a truly open economy. Because an open economy in China's history has meant an economy that is essentially one that subjugates the power of the central government and results in a de facto theft of land, usually because of ports. So when you allow, this has been the history of the world, and it's a history that Westerners are not taught. So let's also consider it from the perspective of foreign investment. If you allow a foreign country to have too much foreign investment, what eventually happens is that you allow you increase the risk of secession. And so suddenly, if one city in your country is either being funded by outside sources or whatnot, the loyalty of that sector will shift simply because people tend to not only follow the money, but also to do what is in their best interest economically. And so, in the case of, you can talk about, we can talk about the context of the Uyghur population, a Turkish Chinese population within China, but I don't have any information on that, so I'm going to skip that. I'm just going to reference it quickly and point out that I just don't have any information on it, so I'm not going to talk about that issue. And the idea has been that unchecked foreign investment typically allows a foreign government to at some point claim that it's going to try to protect a minority that's being abused by a central government in another location, and then invade, and then, rather than go to war, sign a treaty that then forces the centralized government to give up sovereignty over this land, this place that has been essentially segregated either based on investment, jobs, foreign capital, sometimes language, and so on. That was the argument that Russia used when it invaded Crimea, I believe. When you look at the Vietnam War was essentially South Vietnam, the United States installing the brother of an archbishop in order to protect the Catholic, what it considered to be, at that point, a Catholic minority, which was completely ironic because the Catholic political leader at that time, when he was installed, essentially turned around and started discriminating against, the Buddhist majority. That's where you had that famous photo of a Buddhist monk on fire. Self-immolation. He set himself on fire because of discrimination by his own government. But of course, it wasn't really his own government, right? It was a puppet government that was installed by the Americans, who eventually realized their mistake and then got rid of him. So you have this pattern. It's not just the United States, right? You've got Sudan, South Sudan. What is South Sudan? A port. Again, you're trying to separate countries based on utility to the empire. And it's the same way in Ethiopia, Eritrea. Why is there a separate country called Eritrea? Why is there still essentially a small civil war going on? Again, there's value in having access to a port under a Western system. And if you don't have a strong central government, they can't defend all corners of their country, of their land. And as a result, are oftentimes forced to give up sovereignty over usually a port in order to advance U.S. or within the 21st century, post-World War II, it's been the U.S. Globalized trading structure. So when you think about China and we try to criticize China, there are certainly ways to criticize China. And the question is why the United States is not doing it properly. Because by not doing it properly, all it's doing is dividing the world. And you have to sort of look at this situation in the context of a failure of diplomacy. Because if you don't have proper diplomacy, you're going to have just, a divided world, which has consequences for everybody. And quite frankly, what China is arguing when it talks about human rights, and it's not only arguing on the basis of its colonial past. It's not saying anything that's very different from the former CEO of Coca-Cola. I believe Neville Isdell, was his name. And he said the same thing, that you have to allow China to develop at its own pace. And if you try to force China to do something, especially given its past, you're going to poison the lines of communication. They're not going to want to talk to you. And if they're not going to want to talk to you, then you've essentially wiped out diplomacy. And one of the trends in American politics has been, once in a while we try to elect a businessman or somebody with experience in business, thinking that will pave the way to greater prosperity. And what we're really trying to do is replicate what we would consider to be a practical approach, as opposed to a political approach. Because what China is saying is, again, not different from what the former Coca-Cola CEO is saying. And there's a reason for that, right? There's a reason why the politicians are somehow divorced intellectually from the business people, because the business people are looking at essentially making a profit, and they're not necessarily interested. And this is also a bad thing, right? They're not necessarily interested in human rights. They're a sincere believer in the idea that the profit motive, for the most part, will improve everyone's outcomes, which will then create a middle class that will then be, impossible to ignore in terms of, what the West would consider universal human rights. And that's been the corporate American strategy. It hasn't worked because, on the one hand, the Chinese government has been extremely successful in creating a middle class under its own non-Western policies. And because it's got that credibility, it quite frankly probably doesn't have to answer to anyone, especially not a country that's as deeply divided as the United States, politically and so on. And so when you put all these criticisms together, they all have, consequences for individuals, because let's take someone like me. If I want to go to Asia and live there, it's almost impossible because of the former colonial past, a lot of the laws make it very difficult to become a citizen of a foreign country. It's not easy to become an American citizen, but it's doable. And that's just not the case in many other countries, right? Whether it's Qatar, you can't even get, if you live in Qatar for 25 years, you still can't get citizenship. You might get permanent residency, but not citizenship. If you go to Singapore, right, again, very difficult. They can pick and choose who they want. And so there's this idea that the West has a moral stance based on its more liberal immigration policies, which are, of course, tied to citizenship policies, naturalized citizen policies. But from an individual standpoint, if you're thinking about freedom, about globalization, about these so-called Western values, what you're really talking about is the practical ability of someone like myself to be able to go to a Western country and settle down and live a life there and get a job. And the fact of the matter is, despite having a college degree, having no debt, I can't go to an Asian country and settle down, not without a substantial paperwork and so on and so forth. I can't. Same thing with Canada. It doesn't matter where I go, whether it's West or East. So by not having really diplomacy, we've created a world where these so-called human rights are not tied into mobility, and certainly not the mobility of human labor versus capital. And that's really the human rights issue that people ought to focus on first. We're putting the cart before the horse. Instead of talking about human rights, what we ought to do is talk about just diplomacy. And if you're failing in diplomacy, you're not going to get anywhere close to a situation where you're able to advance a human rights objective, a platform. And this is really interesting because China has, of course, 5-year plans, 3-year plans, I think 10-year plans, and 30-year plans. It's got all those are economic. So until China comes up with a 30-year plan or a 10-year plan that advances human rights, this discussion will go nowhere, because of course China is going to prioritize what it knows and what it has publicized. So that if you want to have diplomacy, what you want to say is that, okay, we accept what you say, China. Here's a solution, my potential solution. You've got a 10-year plan for economics. Why don't you do one for human rights? And let's see if we can get on the same page. And that way, if they don't do what they say they're going to do, it weakens the credibility of the Communist Party. And then you've got a way in that will create either change or more conflict, that might be useful for a certain agenda. But right now, by going back and forth, by having these criticisms, it doesn't really work, because again, the Chinese development model is not based on a private sector banking model. It's really based on a government-driven model that seeks to prioritize housing for everybody. And when you have that kind of a situation, you have to again understand that the development is different because the policies are different. And if we live in a country that does not have, wide access to, consumer credit as much as the United States, if you live in a country that's trying to position itself basically on a version of centralized city planning and has a good record of doing that, you have to try to look at it from their perspective. And the perspective of China, of course, is that, we were colonized, we lost all these, places like Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan. And from their perspective, I'm not taking a position on Chinese Taipei or Taiwan, I'm using the word Taiwan. And so, you have to really look at the situation as China is trying to regain its ability to become a sovereign country. And it's done so in Macau. It's done so in Hong Kong. And the question really at this point is whether or not the world can convince China to have a 30-year or 10-year plan on human rights. And the question is, what is that going to look like? Because the whole point of having a one-party system is that you don't, like Singapore, the lawyers don't have as much power. In America, the president's a lawyer. The one before him was a businessman, but the one before him was a lawyer. His wife was a lawyer. President Obama and Michelle Obama both were lawyers. So you have a system that, again, because it relies more on the private sector, you have a system that's just different, right? Because, you have lawyers essentially creating regulation and enforcing regulation rather than a centralized government. And again, the Chinese are following the Singaporean model, which is a more executive-driven model. And ultimately, you have to consider those differences when criticizing China, especially when the Chinese model has worked up to now. And think about it another way. Yes, we Americans will own the property, the land under our single-family homes, but we own the land subject to a government tax. If we don't pay that annual housing tax, we lose the house. There's a lien. A private lawyer will come in and basically take the house at some point. We can have that house condemned by the local government. You have all manners of ways whether a government can actually confiscate that property. And the reason that these single-family homes work is basically because the government makes money on it and the banks make money on it. And all that goes into creating a very strong private sector banking system. In other words, you have a situation where you borrow a lot of money as an individual, and once you borrow that money, that leads to higher home values, which the banks can then use to loan more money. And suddenly you have this debt-driven process that hopefully ends up in prosperity for more people. But if you don't have that debt-driven private banking system model, if you have a more executive government-oriented model, then this model of a single-family home doesn't necessarily make as much sense because you're trying to create essentially incremental knowledge on building houses, especially because you don't have a lot of oil. And so you have to figure out how to not only build enough housing for 1 billion people, but also how to do it in a way that's energy efficient. And so you have to get better every single time you build not an HDB flat if you're in Singapore, or a high-rise if you're in Hong Kong or mainland China. And that's what China is doing. And no one can argue that it's not doing a good job. The expansion is, especially with the middle class, is unparalleled in probably human history. And so you have to look at it as different models. And so when China talks about different development, that's what it means. It means we have a different system. And so stop comparing us to this totally different Western system that is only possible because of a very strong private banking sector that is then tied into a system that allows you, the Americans, to have more single-family homes. That's really what it comes down to. So, if you want to criticize the American model, then you can still go back and say that, well, really it's not necessarily that the government has a lot of power, but lawyers do, right? Your neighbor can sue you and so on and so forth. And the question really is, how much does a one-party state like China or Singapore allow lawyers to take the law into their own hands and try to act as these quasi-government agents in trying to enforce a government policy? And if China doesn't want a lawyer-driven private banking system model because it's been successful using a different model, then you're not going to go anywhere if you start arguing about human rights. You have to get to diplomacy first, and quite frankly, you have to understand history first to try to get somewhere. And if you don't understand history, if you try to put human rights before diplomacy, especially out of context, you're just going to go in circles, and one day you're going to wake up and there's not going to be necessarily walls, but there will be digital walls, digital borders that make it difficult for individuals to move back and forth, which means that you're going to go on a path of less freedom for everyone involved.